December 1941. The world was reduced to two colors, the blinding, endless white of the snow and the grim, industrial gray of the sky. At a shattered railway junction somewhere behind the crumbling lines west of Moscow, the air did not just feel cold. It was a solid metallic presence that seared the lungs and made the slightest movement an act of will. The wind carried the distant faint thunder of artillery, a constant reminder that the front was not a line on a map, but a creeping sickness. On a solitary flat car, amid a graveyard of burnt-out freight wagons and abandoned machinery, stood the tank. It was a Matilda Mark II. In the desolation of the Russian winter, it looked less like a weapon of war and more like a deep-sea creature hauled onto an alien shore. Its smooth, riveted armor plates and rounded turret were utterly foreign, a geometric anomaly against the jagged, frozen landscape. Snow already dusted its hull, settling into the fine grooves of its cast surfaces. This was not a Soviet tank, born of harsh plains and wide horizons. This was a product of drawing boards and factories an unimaginable distance away, a machine built for a different kind of war. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Kalinin approached, his felt boots crunching on the impacted snow. His face, etched with the exhaustion of the long retreat from the borders, was a mask of grim acceptance. The papers in his hand were not orders, they were a sentence. Behind him, his newly assigned crew materialized from the haze of blowing snow, each man carrying the invisible weight of his own past. Alexei, the driver-mechanic, was barely out of his teens. His eyes, which once held the eager light of an engineering student from Leningrad, now held a permanent shadow. They scanned the Matilda's high silhouette and its improbably narrow tracks with instant, professional alarm. He saw not a tank, but a collection of engineering compromises, every inch of it wrong for the deep, grasping snow. Ivan Semyonovich, the loader, was a man whose age was a mystery wrapped in resilience. Called Batya, father, by instinct, he had the broad, calloused hands of a lifetime spent in the Ural factories. His gaze moved over the British machine, not with skepticism, but with a cold, analytical practicality, noting the placement of hatches, the weld seams, the potential weaknesses and strengths. He was a man who understood metal, and this metal was unfamiliar. Petro, the gunner and radio operator, stood slightly apart. A Ukrainian from Kharkiv, his history was a closed book, his dark eyes guarded and distant. He ignored the tank for a moment, his attention caught by the stenciled English lettering on the wooden ammunition crates stacked nearby. The Cyrillic translations painted beneath them were sloppy, hurried. He traced a gloved finger over the words, a stranger even to the language of his own shells. A Red Army quartermaster, his breath a frantic cloud, shoved a thin, poorly printed manual into Kalinin's hands. The pages were already damp and limp. "From our allies," the man muttered, his voice stripped of any emotion by the cold. "Infantry tank. The armor is thick, the gun is weak, the engine is diesel. It will freeze if you let it. Do not let it." The crew mounted the flat car, the steel biting through their boots with an immediate, malevolent cold. The tank loomed over them, silent and imposing in its otherness. Kalinin pulled open the heavy side hatch. A faint, peculiar smell wafted out, a blend of factory-fresh paint, high-grade lubricating oil, and something subtly organic, like English leather and wool. It was the smell of a world that had not known this kind of winter, this kind of war. One by one, they disappeared into the belly of the beast. The interior was a claustrophobic iron crypt. The space was shockingly confined, dominated by the massive, obtrusive breech of the 2-pounder gun. There was no hint of a heater, only the pervasive, bone-deep chill of the steel that surrounded them. Alexei squeezed into the driver's compartment, his shoulders rubbing against unmarked levers and pedals labeled in an alien alphabet. His world became a narrow slit of white and a dashboard of mysteries. Batya tested the manual turret traverse mechanism, his powerful arms straining against an unexpected resistance, a gearing system not made for his strength. Petro donned the radio headset. Instead of the familiar crackle of Soviet traffic, his ears were flooded with a burst of rapid nasal English speech, followed by static, and then a fragment of a German transmission. He was isolated in a bubble of incomprehensible noise. Kalinin stood partially exposed in the commander's cupola, the freezing wind knifing through his greatcoat. He looked out at the vast, white expanse of his burning country. Then he looked down into the cramped, foreign interior of this machine. A profound and bitter skepticism took root in his chest. This was not a weapon to defend Moscow. This was a political gesture, a complex, fragile toy. They were being sent to meet the steel fist of the Wehrmacht in a tin box from another world. With a series of commands barked into the intercom, the ritual began. Alexei, deciphering the controls through touch and guesswork, engaged the starter. The engine turned over with a lethargic groan, then caught with a sudden, deep-throated roar that was entirely different from the high-revving scream of a T-34. The entire hull vibrated around them, a strange, new, metallic heartbeat. A plume of white diesel exhaust, thick in the frigid air, enveloped the flat car. The order to move arrived not as a written command, but as a frantic shout from a dispatcher running down the line. The situation at the front was deteriorating by the hour. There were no reserves, no more T-34s. The Matildas were now part of the line. Kalinin acknowledged with a sharp nod he knew no one could see. "Driver, forward. Take us off." The Matilda lurched, its narrow tracks scrambling for purchase on the icy ramp of the flat car. For a terrifying second, it seemed it would slip sideways. Then it crunched down onto the Russian earth with a ground-shaking thud. And immediately it began to sink. The tracks, designed for the firm soils of France, plunged into the deep, unpacked snow almost to their full height. The tank did not roll. It wallowed, lurching and pitching like a barge in a choppy sea. Its progress was agonizingly slow, a labored crawl that mocked the very concept of blitzkrieg. They fell in behind a ragged procession. A few other struggling Matildas, several small tracked universal carriers skittering like insects, and a column of Siberian infantrymen, their faces grim and fur-clad, marching with a steady, grim determination through the snowdrifts. The infantrymen glanced at the odd, floundering tanks. A voice, sharp and clear, cut through the wind. "Hey, look! The English have sent us their moving bathtubs." Another joined in. "No, it's a samovar on tracks, a tea-urn, for the front." The nickname stuck, spreading through the column with weary amusement. The traveling tea-urn. Inside the lead Matilda, the crew heard the jibes through the open hatch. No one spoke. The engine's alien roar filled the space, but beneath it was a heavier silence, woven from individual threads of fear, memory, and profound doubt. They were encased in 30 tons of borrowed steel, a misunderstanding on tracks, heading directly into the heart of a storm that had swallowed armies whole. Suddenly, a new sound sliced through the rumble of their engine and the howl of the wind, the rising, shrieking whine of aircraft engines in a dive. Before any conscious thought could form, a shadow flashed overhead. Not one but three jagged shapes, German Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, screamed past at treetop height, their distinctive inverted gull wings clear against the gray sky. They were not attacking the column. They were racing toward the front, toward Moscow. But the last pilot, perhaps spotting the unusual shapes of the British tanks, perhaps out of sheer malice, banked slightly. A line of heavy machine gun fire stitched across the snow, walking its way toward the crawling Matildas. Brrr, tang, tang, thud. A string of bullets slammed into the frontal armor of Kalinin's tank. Inside, the noise was catastrophic. A deafening, violent clangor, like being inside a monstrous bell struck by a sledgehammer. The crew flinched as one, hearts seizing. Sparks flashed in the driver's compartment. A sharp, acrid smell of scorched metal and cordite filtered through the air. As quickly as it came, the aircraft was gone, the sound of its engine fading into the constant thunder of the front. An eerie, ringing silence descended inside the tank, broken only by the ragged sound of their own breathing. Kalinin looked down through his vision blocks. There, on the thick but foreign armor just beside his head, were 4 fresh, deep gashes in the steel. Bright raw metal gleamed from within the scars, a violent graffiti left by the war. The jokes from the infantry had stopped. The theoretical had just become terrifyingly real. The T-urn had been baptized by fire. Kalinin's voice, when it finally came over the intercom, was stripped of all previous doubt, hardened into a single, sharp point of purpose. Close hatches. Battle stations. Driver, increase speed. We are not going to the front. He paused, the words hanging in the frozen, charged air. The front is coming to us. The world shrunk to a slit of white, the reek of hot metal, and the deafening, confined roar of their own machine. The Stuka's parting gift, those 4 raw scars on the frontal plate, hung in the mind's eye of every crew member, a silent, more eloquent manual than any translated pamphlet. The Matilda was no longer an abstract foreign curiosity. It was a target, and they were trapped inside it. The column pushed deeper into a skeletal birch forest. The trees, stripped bare by winter and artillery blast, stood like broken white bones against the slate sky. The Matilda's narrow tracks continued to betray them. On the icy road, they slithered unpredictably. Off it, in the deeper snow between the trees, they sank into a quagmire of white, the engine screaming in protest as it fought not the enemy, but the very earth it was supposed to defend. Alexei, swimming in sweat inside his frozen compartment, wrestled with the unresponsive steering levers. His hands, clumsy and thick gloves, slipped on the unfamiliar controls. Each lurch, each sickening slide towards a tree trunk, was a personal failure. He could feel the collective skepticism of the marching infantry outside, who overtook them with grim efficiency. The tank, this symbol of armored might, was being humiliated by a snowdrift. Kalinin, his face pressed against the cold glass of the vision block, navigated with a simmering fury. He was not a tank commander here, but a ship's captain, piloting a barge through an Arctic swamp. His commands to Alexei were short, harsh bursts of direction, each one layered with the unspoken terror of immobilization. To be stuck here, a steel pillbox waiting for a German anti-tank team, was his deepest professional dread. Then the first sounds of real battle reached them, not as distant thunder, but as distinct, terrifying signatures. the dry, rapid crack of German MG-34s, the deeper, slower reply of Soviet Maxim guns. And cutting through it all, the unmistakable bone-jarring crump of mortar explosions, walking closer through the woods. A frantic runner, his face a mask of soot and panic, emerged from the tree line, waving them down. Kalinin threw open his hatch, the cold air a slap. "Tanks! German tanks! In the clearing ahead! They've broken through the rifle company!" The order was chaos, given in a scream. "Your machines! Stop them! Buy time for the flank to pull back!" The theoretical was over. The map was now the clearing ahead. Kalinin's voice over the intercom changed. The frustration was gone, replaced by a cold, metallic clarity. "Driver forward. Gunner high explosive. Loader stand by. We go in." The Matilda lurched out of the tree line, leaving the comparative safety of the forest. Before them lay a scene from a different, more dynamic war. A war they were not equipped for. 2 German Panzer IIIs, their long 50mm guns sleek and predatory, were maneuvering with methodical confidence across the snowy field, methodically shelling the crumbling Soviet infantry positions. Their wider tracks gave them stability, a predatory grace the wallowing Matilda lacked. Around them, German infantry in greatcoats advanced in short, disciplined rushes. The Soviet infantry, seeing the unfamiliar shape of the Matilda, did not cheer. They stared, hope and confusion battling on their frozen faces. "Gunner, traverse right. Tank in the open. Range 400. Petro, his earlier detachment vanished, hunched over his sight. The world narrowed to crossed hairs and the gray-green shape of the Panzer. He breathed out, freezing the moment. "On target!" Fire! The Matilda shuddered with its first combat shot. The sound inside was catastrophic, a physical blow to the chest. Through his sight, Petro saw the shell strike the German tank's glacis plate in a flash of orange and sparks. A direct hit, and it bounced. The high explosive shell, useless against armor, had shattered harmlessly. The Panzer III rocked slightly, then its turret began to swing towards them. A slow, inevitable movement of doom. A wave of cold despair flooded the compartment. Their weapon was a toy. They had just announced their presence with a firecracker. "Armor piercing! Now!" Kalinin roared, his voice cracking. Batya, a monument of calm in the chaos, had already anticipated the failure. His hands moved with a brutal, rehearsed efficiency. The spent casing clanged on the floor. A new, heavier solid shot shell was in the breach before the echo died. Up. Fire. The second shot was different, a sharper, harder crack. This time the result was not a spark, but a metallic scream. The AP round struck the Panzer III's turret ring, jerking it to a halt. Smoke began to pour from the hatches. A cheer started from the Soviet trenches, then died abruptly. The second Panzer had found its aim. A flash from its muzzle. A fraction of a second later, a world-ending impact against the Matilda's hull. The sound was a hammer blow on a cathedral bell, multiplied 1,000 times inside the steel box. Lights flickered. Dust and paint chips snowed from the ceiling. Alexei's head smashed against his periscope, seeing stars. Petro was thrown against his sight, a sharp pain blooming in his shoulder. But they were alive. The thick British armor, the very thing that made it slow and clumsy, had held. The 50mm shell had failed to penetrate. The shock was replaced by a wild, desperate surge of confidence. They could take a hit. "Driver, hard left. Don't let him get a second shot. Gunner, aim for his tracks. Cripple him." The Matilda wallowed into a turn, its vulnerable side armor exposed for a terrifying moment. The German gunner fired again. The shell whined past, missing by inches, throwing up a geyser of frozen earth. Petro, fighting nausea and pain, fired on the move. The shot was wide, kicking up snow behind the Panzer. "Reload!" Batya was a machine, sweat freezing on his brow, feeding the hungry breech. Another AP shell. "Up!" The Matilda slammed to a halt, presenting its stout front again. The Panzer was turning, presenting its flank. A mistake. "Fire!" This shot was true. It struck the German tank's rear sprocket, shearing metal. The track whiplashed off its wheels with a sound of tearing steel. The Panzer III lurched, spinning awkwardly, immobilized. They had not killed it, but they had maimed it. The field, for a moment, was static, but the battle was not won. From the opposite tree line, a new horror emerged. A Soviet T-34, its angular form beautiful and deadly, charged into the clearing, its diesel roaring a familiar song. It ignored the crippled Panzer and charged the second one, a brave, suicidal ballet. It fired once, twice, scoring hits that sparked, but did not kill. It closed the distance impossibly fast, a wolf among slower dogs. The German Panzer, distracted by this new, agile threat, fired a final desperate shot at point-blank range. The T-34's turret was blown clean off its ring, landing with a sickening crunch in the snow. The hull, now a funeral pyre, rolled on for a few more meters before stopping, flames licking greedily from every hatch. Inside the Matilda, they watched, breath held. The death of the T-34 was a personal, intimate loss. It was the death of the machine they should have had, a machine that might have won this fight. Its sacrifice, however, had given them an opening. The German crew, perhaps low on ammunition, perhaps shaken by the immobilized tank and the stubborn Matilda, began to retreat, their tank backing swiftly into the woods, covering the infantry's withdrawal. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning T-34 and the moans of the wounded in the field. Kalinin ordered the hatch open. The cold air that flooded in was thick with the smells of cordite, diesel fuel, and burnt flesh. They had survived. They had, even in a twisted way, prevailed. But as Alexei tried to move their tank to cover, a new, more insidious enemy revealed itself. The intense strain, the violent maneuvers in the deep snow, had taken a hidden toll. With a sickening grind and a final shuddering lurch, the left track stopped responding. The Matilda slewed sideways, digging itself into a furrow of its own making. The engine whined, but the tank was going nowhere. They were immobilized. Not by a German shell, but by the Russian winter and their own machine's fragility. The elation of survival curdled into a cold, sinking dread. They were sitting ducks. The T-Urn had proven it could take a punch. Now it had to prove it could survive the freezing night that was descending, alone in a contested forest, with a broken leg. The battle was over. The fight for survival had just entered a new, more desperate phase. The silence after the battle was not peaceful. It was a suffocating blanket, heavy with the smell of burning oil and snow-choked smoke. Their Matilda, tilted awkwardly in its own frozen grave, was a monument to impotence. The left track lay dead, a massive, frozen serpent of steel links half buried in the churned, blackened snow. Every attempt by Alexei to engage the gears produced only a horrifying, grinding shriek from the stricken final drive, a sound that felt like the tank's death rattle and echoed far too loudly in the silent woods. Kalinin knew the truth with a commander's cold clarity. To stay was to die. The Germans would send patrols. They would send a pioneer team with explosives, or worse, they would simply ignore them, leaving the crew to freeze or starve inside their steel coffin. The burning T-34 on the clearing's edge was a grim preview. "Out!" His voice crackled over the dead intercom. Then he shouted it, raw and loud. "Everyone out! Now!" They emerged into the twilight like men leaving a shipwreck. The cold was a physical assault after the adrenaline-fueled heat of the fight. Petro cradled his bruised shoulder. Alexei's forehead was caked with frozen blood from the periscope strike. They stood on the hull of their broken beast, looking at the devastation. The two crippled tanks, theirs and the German Panzer with its shredded track, sat under the same darkening sky. Between them lay the dead. Batya did not look at the bodies. He looked at the track. He jumped down, his boots sinking deep, and approached the immobilized left side. He ran a bare, calloused hand over the frozen metal of the broken drive sprocket, ignoring the cold that seared his skin. He grunted, a low, thoughtful sound. "We cannot fix the gear here," he said, his voice the first practical thing in this unreal landscape. "But if we do not move, we are dead. The track must grip. It cannot grip this." He kicked at the deep, powdery snow. Kalinin followed his gaze, understanding dawning. The infantry pulled back to the next line. "There is a village on the map, 2 kilometers east. Maybe standing, maybe not." It was not a plan. It was the only direction left. They gathered what they could: small arms, the precious toolkit, a can of frozen lubricant. They moved not as a tank crew, but as survivors, abandoning their post. The walk through the darkening forest was a nightmare of deep snow and lurking shadows. Every distant crack of a branch was a German rifle bolt. The glow of the burning T-34 faded behind them, leaving only the blue, malevolent light of the rising moon on the snow. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, they saw it, a cluster of black shapes against the white. The village of Podvolokai was not a village anymore. It was a charcoal sketch. Most izbas were burnt-out skeletons, their roofs collapsed. But one, at the far end, near a frozen well, stood mostly intact, its chimney hinting at a miracle. Cautiously, they approached. The door hung open. Inside it was dark, colder than outside, but for the absence of wind. The room had been looted, but not recently. A massive, brick Russian stove dominated one wall, and in the center of the dirt floor, a sight more beautiful than any warm bed: a blacksmith's forge. It was a simple portable setup, likely used for shoeing horses and repairing carts, but to Batya, it was salvation. A heavy anvil sat beside it. A set of hammers and tongs lay scattered, as if the smith had fled mid-stroke. "This," Batya said, a flicker of life in his eyes for the first time, "this is our workshop." Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, was kindled. They worked with the desperate efficiency of men given a final chance. Alexei and Petro, using an axe found in the ruins, began hacking down a young birch, dragging it back for fuel. Kalinin stood watch, his PPSH cradled in his arms, scanning the tree line for movement. Inside, Batya became a man possessed. He lit the forge with precious matches, nursing the coals to a faint, then a fierce, red glow. The heat radiating from it was the first true warmth they had felt in days. The plan was born from necessity and Batya's factory-honed genius. "The tracks are too narrow," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. "They cut through the snow like a knife, then sink. We need to make them wider. We need paddles." Using the hammers and the anvil, he began to work on the first piece of scrap metal they had brought, a shattered fender from a German truck found near the village. He heated the steel in the forge until it glowed orange. Then, with powerful, measured blows, he began to flatten and shape it. He was not just repairing. He was re-engineering. He fashioned heavy, crude triangles of steel, each with 2 holes drilled painfully slowly with a hand auger. By dawn, they had a dozen. Their hands were blistered, their faces smudged with soot, their bodies aching with exhaustion. But they had a purpose. The trek back to the Matilda at first light was a tense, silent journey. Every moment expected to find the tank destroyed or occupied. But there it was, as they had left it, a silent, frozen sentinel. The German Panzer was gone, towed away in the night. They were alone. Working in shifts, 2 manning watch with rifles while the others labored, they began the transformation. Using heavy wrenches and sheer brute force, they bolted Batia's handmade steel triangles onto the outer edges of every other track link on both sides. The process was agonizingly slow. Fingers stuck to frozen metal, nuts stripped, tools slipped. But as the sun climbed, a change became visible. The Matilda was growing primitive, jagged fins. Alexei the mechanic understood the theory instantly. Like snowshoes, he whispered, awe in his voice. You are turning it into a snow tank. Batia merely grunted, tightening another bolt with a final satisfying wrench turn. The final test came with the last triangle secured. Alexei climbed back into the driver's compartment, his heart hammering against his ribs. He prayed to the cold, indifferent gods of machinery. He engaged the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. He pushed the left steering lever. There was a moment of terrible tension, the sound of metal screaming in protest. Then, with a lurch that threw Batia and Petro off the hull, the tank moved. The left track, its new steel paddles biting deep into the snow, found purchase. It dragged the massive hull forward, out of the frozen rut that had been its tomb. It was not graceful. It was a clumsy, grinding, monumental movement. But it was forward. They were mobile. As Alexei guided the tank in a slow, triumphant circle around the clearing, a new problem announced itself. In the intense cold, the engine, once stopped, would never start again without an external heat source. They had solved mobility, but created a new vulnerability. Petro, scavenging in the ruined village, found the answer. A pair of blowtorches, their tanks half full of paraffin. Another tool of the village blacksmith, Kalinin formulated the doctrine then and there, the Podvolaki procedure. Before any halt longer than a minute, the blowtorches would be lit. One would be shoved under the engine bay on a makeshift tray. The other played carefully over the frozen fuel lines. The tank would carry its own miniature portable thawing station. They were no longer just a crew operating a machine. They had become symbiotic with it. They had grafted their own will to survive onto its foreign frame. The Matilda was no longer just a British tank. It was a hybrid, a creature of the Urals and the Siberian winter, reborn in a blacksmith's forge from scrap and desperation. As they turned the tank's nose east, towards the last reported Soviet lines, towards Moscow, it moved with a new, awkward confidence. It left behind not just the clearing, but its identity as a traveling tea urn. In its wake, the tracks now left a strange, wide, paddled imprint in the snow, the unique signature of a beast that had learned to hunt in a new ice age. They had won their first victory, not against the Germans, but against the land itself. And they knew, with a cold certainty, that the land would demand more payments before the end. The hybrid Matilda, now a grotesque yet purposeful beast with its steel fins, carved a new kind of path through the deep forest. It no longer wallowed helplessly. It crunched, it grated, it shoved mountains of snow aside with its broadened track print. Inside, the crew existed in a state of heightened, raw awareness. The initial euphoria of mobility had been replaced by the grinding reality of their situation. They were alone behind shifting lines, in a tank that howled its presence with every revolution of its bolted-on paddles, a sound that felt as subtle as a forge hammer in the silent woods. They navigated by a shattered compass, and Kalinин's instinct, moving east towards the choked murmur of the front. The forest grew denser, the pines heavy with snow that fell in silent clumps. It was Petro, his ear perpetually tuned to the crackling void of the radio, who first caught the whisper of their opportunity, a fragmented German transmission, weak and distorted. A supply column, lost, behind schedule, taking a forest track north of Grid Point Adler to avoid Soviet artillery. A sergeant complaining about the cold and the damn Russians who seemed to melt into the trees. Kalinin spread the grimy, nearly useless map on the engine deck. He pointed to a thin, meandering line, a logging trail, not marked as a road. It cut across their path to the east. A predator's calculus flickered in his eyes. They were not a front-line tank anymore. They were a wound behind the lines. Perhaps they could be a weapon. "We do not break through to our lines," he said, his voice low and flat in the freezing air. "We hunt along theirs." They reached the logging trail an hour before dusk. It was a narrow tunnel through the pines, its surface a mix of frozen mud and deep, untrodden snow. Perfect. Kalinin ordered Alexei to drive the Matilda 100 meters off the trail, deep into a thicket of young firs. They killed the engine. The silence was immediate and immense. Then began the meticulous, frozen ritual of becoming ghosts. Batya and Petro, using branches cut with their entrenching tools, swept away the deep tank tracks leading to their hiding spot. They cloaked the Matilda's hull and turret with a shroud of cut pine branches, their needles already brown and dry. They packed snow over the muzzle of the 2-pounder and the machine gun, leaving only the slits of the vision blocks clear. From 20 meters, the tank ceased to exist, becoming just another snowy mound in a forest of them. Inside, the cold returned with a vengeance, a creeping, patient enemy. They did not run the engine. They sat in the deepening dark, wrapped in every piece of cloth they had, breathing shallow clouds that frosted the steel around them. They shared a single piece of hardtack, sucking on it to create the illusion of sustenance. Time lost meaning, measured only by the gradual numbing of toes and the slow arc of the moon through the tree branches visible through Kalinin's open hatch. It was past midnight when the sound came. Not engines first, but the rhythmic, squeaking crunch of boots on frozen snow, the jingle of equipment, the low murmur of voices speaking a guttural, unfamiliar language. German pointmen, cautious, scanning the woods with flashlight beams that swept like pale, accusing fingers over their snow-covered hull. The beam passed directly over Petro's vision block. He stopped breathing. The light lingered for an eternity on the strange, angular shapes of the bolted-on paddles, now just snow-dusted humps, then moved on. Behind the scouts came the vehicles. A canvas-covered Opel Blitz truck, its wheels chained, grinding slowly. Then another, and between them, the prize. A German Panzer II, a light reconnaissance tank, its thin armor and small 20mm cannon, no match for the Matilda at close range. The column was vulnerable, tired, moving blind. Kalinin waited. He let the point men pass. He let the first truck pass their position. His whispered commands over the intercom were the only sound in their frozen world. Gunner, tank, traverse right. Quietly. Petro turned the manual traverse with agonizing slowness, the mechanism groaning softly in the cold. The Panzer II's side, pale in the moonlight, filled his sight. Driver, start engine on my mark. The column was fully abreast of them now, the second truck's exhaust clouding the air. The Panzer II was perfectly broadside, 30 meters away. Now, Alexei hit the starter. In the silent forest, the diesel roar was cataclysmic. The engine bellowed to life, shaking the snow from their camouflage. The German column froze for a single, comical second of pure shock. Fire! The Matilda's first shot was not a bark, but a thunderclap that split the night. The armor-piercing round tore through the Panzer II's flank just behind the turret, with a sound of ripping metal. The little tank did not burn. It seemed to simply die, its engine stuttering to a halt, hatches flying open as stunned crewmen bailed out into the snow. Before the echo died, Batya had already slammed another round home. Up! Kalinin didn't bother with the second truck. Infantry, in the trees. Machine gun now. Petro swiveled the Bisa machine gun, its sound a faster, more vicious tearing of the night. Tracer rounds hosed the disoriented German infantry scrambling from the first truck, cutting dark shapes down in the moonlit snow. Chaos was complete. The lead truck lurched forward only to skid and jackknife, blocking the narrow trail. Kalinin put a high-explosive shell into its engine block for good measure, and it burst into flames, painting the nightmare scene in flickering orange and black. It was not a battle. It was an ambush of perfect, merciless execution. Over in less than 90 seconds. The surviving Germans, leaderless and panicked, fled back down the trail into the darkness, leaving their dead, their wounded, and their precious supplies. The crew sat in the sudden, ringing silence, their ears numb, their nostrils filled with the stink of cordite and burning gasoline. The adrenaline was a fire in their veins, burning away the cold. They had done it. They had become the forest, and the forest had killed. But Kalinin's order was immediate. Driver forward back onto the trail. Batya, Petro, grab what you can, food, ammunition, medicine, 1 minute. The Matilda crunched out of its hiding place, now a revealed monster. While Alexei kept the engine running, Batya and Petro moved like ghosts in the firelight, their shadows huge and leaping. They threw tins of meat, boxes of machine gun belts, and a precious case of German medical supplies into the fighting compartment. They did not look at the wounded. There was no time for mercy, only for theft. As they finished, a new sound rose in the distance from the west, from where the column had come, the deeper, more powerful growl of German tank engines. Not lost supply vehicles. Hunting Panthers. "Go now!" Kalinin yelled. Alexei threw the Matilda into gear. They charged down the trail in the opposite direction, away from the reinforcements, their paddled tracks throwing up a plume of snow behind them. They drove for 20 frantic minutes before Kalinin ordered them off the trail again, plunging back into the deep, concealing woods. They halted in a small clearing. The tank's exterior steamed in the cold, heat radiating from its barrel and engine deck. Inside, they were panting, trembling, not from fear now, but from a wild, savage exhilaration. They had been the prey. Now, for one night, they had been the predator. Batya opened a tin of German liverwurst. The rich, fatty smell filled the compartment, a smell of victory, of stolen life. They ate with their fingers, saying nothing, the taste better than any feast. But as the adrenaline faded, the cold and the reality seeped back in. They were deeper behind German lines than before. They were marked. The neat, paddled track prints they left were as unique as a signature. They had won a battle, but they had painted a target on themselves for every German patrol between here and Moscow. Kalinin looked at his crew in the dim green glow of the instrument lights. Their faces were smeared with soot, sweat, and grease, but their eyes held a new, hard light. They were no longer just survivors in a broken tank. They were snow ghosts, and the night belonged to them. For as long as their fuel, their ammunition, and their luck held out. He knew the last of those would run out first. The high of the ambush was a fleeting fever. It burned away, leaving behind a colder, more brittle reality. They were ghosts with a telltale signature. The wide, paddled track was a brand in the snow, an arrow pointing straight to them. They moved now with a new kind of tension, not just of men hunted, but of predators who knew their own spoor was poison. For 2 days they played a desperate game of chess with the forest. They stuck to frozen creek beds, where the running water beneath the ice obscured their tracks. They navigated through dense virgin thickets, where the snow lay unbroken, their steel fins tearing through undergrowth with a noise that felt deafening in the immense quiet. They avoided all open ground, all villages, every logical path east. The map was a lie. Their world was defined by the next copse of trees, the next ravine to hide in. The stolen German rations soured in their mouths. The liverwurst now tasted of iron and guilt. Every tin opened was a countdown, a reminder of their dwindling margin for error. The cold was no longer just an enemy. It was a constant, draining companion that seeped into their bones, slowing their thoughts, making their fingers clumsy on the frozen controls. It was on the morning of the 3rd day, in the pale, bleak light, that the flaw revealed itself. They were negotiating a gentle, snow-covered slope, aiming for the cover of a pine grove below. Alexei, his eyes red-rimmed from strain and lack of sleep, guided the tank with a delicate touch. The left track, with its jury-rigged paddles, bit into the crust. There was a sudden, sharp, metallic pop, like a giant's bone snapping. The Matilda lurched violently to one side, throwing the crew against the hard steel walls. A terrible grinding screech of tortured metal replaced the familiar grind of the tracks. The tank slewed to a stop, listing noticeably to port. Alexei tried to engage the gears. The right track churned snow, the left remained dead, but now with a finality that spoke of internal catastrophe. Silence, heavy and absolute, fell inside the tank. It was the silence they had dreaded more than the sound of gunfire. They clambered out into the biting air, a grim procession. The damage was both obvious and profound. The immense repeated stress of their off-road flight, the brutal leverage of the bolted-on paddles acting as giant levers, had done its work. The final drive housing on the left side, the intricate, unforgiving gear system that translated the engine's power to the track, had cracked. A dark, viscous stream of gear oil stained the pure white snow beneath the hull like a black tear. Several of Batya's proud steel fins were bent backwards or sheared clean off, the bolts ripped from the frozen track links. Their adaptation, their salvation, had become their doom. It had transmitted forces the delicate British machinery was never designed to bear. Batya crouched in the snow, running a hand over the cracked casting. His face, usually an impassive mask of practicality, crumpled for a single, unguarded moment. It was the look of a master craftsman whose creation had failed. This was not a field repair. This was a death sentence. Kalinin scanned the horizon with his field glasses. The pine grove was still 100 meters away. They were exposed on a white slope, a black insect on a sheet of paper. To the west, a column of thick, greasy smoke smudged the sky. A burning village, or the aftermath of an artillery strike. The front was a living thing, moving, breathing, consuming. And they were stuck in its path. The weight of command settled on Kalinin's shoulders, like a physical yoke. Every option was terrible. Abandon the tank and try to slip through on foot as the temperature plunged towards -30? They would be deserters, and they would freeze, or be captured within hours. Radio for help. Their sets could barely receive. Transmitting would be a beacon for every German direction-finding unit within 10 kilometers. Stay and fight from a stationary position. They had maybe 24 shells left. They would become a minor footnote, a stubborn pillbox silenced by a single howitzer or a pioneer's satchel charge. Alexei, driven by mechanic's despair, tried to crawl under the listing hull with a wrench. He emerged minutes later, his cheeks scraped raw, his expression hollow. The housing is split. The gears are jammed with metal shavings. It's finished. The word hung in the air. Finished. It was Petro, the quiet observer, who pointed a trembling finger eastwards, past the pine grove. Look. Through the trees, on a distant ridge, a line of dark, moving specks resolved into figures. Soldiers. The lazy, weaving pattern of their movement, the lack of urgency, was unmistakable. It was a German patrol, sweeping the area. They were perhaps 2 kilometers away, moving in a line that would eventually intersect their slope. The crisis was no longer theoretical. It was marching towards them through the snow, with rifles and grenades. Kalinin made the decision. It was not a choice between good and bad, but between a quick death and a purposeful one. If they were finished, they would finish on their own terms. He ordered them back inside the frozen steel shell. He spread the map, his finger finding a feature he had noted earlier. A low hill, marked only by a topographic line, overlooking a crossroads a kilometer to the south. A crossroads German supplies would use. A crossroads German tanks would use to push forward. "We do not wait for them to find us," he said, his voice stripped of all inflection. "We move there." He tapped the hill. "We dig in. We become a fort, a thorn. We make them bleed for every minute they spend removing us." It was a suicide pact. But it was a pact with a target. The next hours were a frenzy of horrific labor. With the engine capable of only turning one track, Alexei performed a maneuver of heartbreaking patience and skill, using the single working right track to pivot the crippled Matilda in an agonizingly slow, multi-point turn towards the hill. It was a dance of a dying beast. They moved at a snail's pace, the broken final drive shrieking in protest with every yard. They reached the hill as the sun began its early descent. The hill was not strategic. It was merely a bump with a view. That was all they needed. Using shovels, their hands, and the tank itself, to bulldoze snow and frozen earth, they began to entomb the Matilda. They dug until its hull settled into the Russian soil, leaving only the turret and the thick frontal plate exposed. They packed snow and ice around it, creating a glacis. They became not a tank, but a fixed fortification, a part of the landscape itself. As they worked, the German patrol vanished into a fold in the land. But the threat did not dissipate. It thickened in the air. The crossroads below remained empty, a pale scar on the white land. It was a trap they were setting for themselves. Exhausted, they slumped inside their steel tomb. The temperature plummeted. Without the ability to run the engine for heat, the cold became an active, penetrating presence. Their breath froze on the interior walls, building a second, crystalline armor inside. They passed around the last of their water, now slush. They checked and rechecked their remaining ammunition. 18 armor-piercing rounds, 6 high-explosive, 3 belts for the machine gun. Kalinin took the first watch, his face a pale moon in the gloom of the cupola. He watched the crossroads. He watched the western tree line where the patrol had vanished. He watched the empty, darkening sky. They had transformed from hunters to ghosts, and now from ghosts to a monument. Their great, hybrid machine was finally, truly broken. All that was left was the crew inside it, a handful of cold, determined men, waiting in their self-made grave for a chance to sell their lives at the highest possible price. The battle for survival was over. The last stand had begun. Entombed in the frozen hill, the Matilda ceased to be a tank. It became a geological feature, a cyst of cold iron and colder resolve. The world narrowed to the slits of their vision blocks, framing a monochrome panorama of the crossroads below and the skeletal forest beyond. Inside, time dissolved into a cycle of watch shifts, measured by the slow creep of shadow and the painful, shared rituals of survival. They melted snow in a tin over a precious candle for water. They spoke in monosyllables, hoarding warmth and energy. The cold was no longer an external force. It was the very medium they existed in, seeping from the steel into their marrow, making thought viscous and slow. Dawn of the first day bled across the sky, revealing no movement. The crossroads remained empty, a taunting strip of untouched snow. The tension was worse than action. It was a slow tightening of a vice made of silence and cold. Alexei, taking his watch, fought a hallucinatory urge to see the tank move, to feel the engine's vibration. His hands kept twitching towards the dead steering levers. It was Batya, his eyes the most accustomed to judging distance and scale, who spotted the first sign of life in the late morning. Not Germans. A ragged column of figures emerging from the eastern tree line, stumbling through the deep snow towards the crossroads. Civilians. A dozen or so, mostly women and old men, bundles on their backs, fleeing eastwards ahead of the German advance. They were ghosts from a dying world, moving with the desperate, shuffling gait of the hunted. From their hill, the crew watched, powerless. To reveal themselves was to doom these people, drawing attention to a position that was, for now, invisible. They watched as the column painfully neared the crossroads. Then, from the opposite tree line, the western one, a single motorcycle with a sidecar emerged, kicking up a plume of snow. A German reconnaissance patrol. The motorcycle stopped. The soldier in the sidecar stood, raising a rifle. A command, sharp and unintelligible from the distance, cut the air. The refugee column froze. A shot rang out. A flat, cruel crack. One of the old men at the front of the column crumpled into the snow. A silent scream seemed to vibrate through the frozen air. The other civilians fell to their knees, hands raised. Kalinin's knuckles were white on the turret rim. "Gunner! Machine gun! That motorcycle! Range 300. Petro's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage that momentarily burned through the cold. He traversed the turret a fraction, the frozen mechanism groaning. He centered the crosshairs on the standing soldier. "Do not fire." Kalinin's voice was a strained wire. It was not mercy. It was tactics of the damned. One burst from their besa would save the civilians momentarily, but would call down an avalanche of steel on their hill, ensuring the refugees' destruction, along with their own. They were not here to save a dozen souls. They were here to kill 100 enemy soldiers. The arithmetic of total war was monstrous. They watched, each man sealing a private chamber of hell within himself, as the German soldier leisurely rummaged through the refugees' bundles, tossing aside pitiful possessions, before waving them on with contempt. The column stumbled forward, leaving the dark shape of the old man in the snow behind, a permanent stain on their retinas. The motorcycle turned and sped back west. The incident left a new silence inside the tank, heavier than before, poisoned by shame and impotent fury. It was a reminder of what they were sacrificing by their inaction, of the cost of their chosen grave. The response came in the afternoon. The Germans were probing, testing the new silence in this sector. A half-track, towing a light infantry gun, nosed cautiously out of the western woods and onto the road leading to the crossroads. It was a feeling-out force, meant to draw fire, to map resistance. "Steady," Kalinin breathed, his eye glued to the periscope. "Let them commit." The half-track advanced to the center of the crossroads. Soldiers dismounted, beginning to unlimber the gun. They were setting up a checkpoint, securing the route. They were arrogant, exposed. Perfect. Gunner, AP, half-track, engine block. The Matilda's first shot in its new life as a fortress was a declaration. The roar was muffled by their earthen berm, but the effect was electric. The armor-piercing round passed clean through the half-track's thin rear armor and detonated in its engine. The vehicle vanished in a ball of greasy black smoke and orange flame. The German soldiers around it were thrown like rag dolls. Chaos. Survivors scrambled for the ditches. The unlimbered gun was abandoned. For 10 minutes, nothing but the crackle of burning fuel. Then, the German answer. Mortar rounds, their flight a soft whispering sigh, began to walk up the slope towards their hill. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. Frozen earth and snow geysered around their position. Shrapnel rattled against the Matilda's exposed turret like hail on a tin roof. Inside, the concussions were physical blows to the chest, shaking dust and ice crystals from every joint. "They're ranging," Kalinin stated, unnervingly calm. "They don't know what we are yet." The mortars stopped. The next probe was bolder. A Panzer III, its commander visible in the cupola, advanced down the road, its gun scanning the tree line, the burnt-out half-track, before finally settling on their hill. It saw the unnatural mound, the exposed turret. The turret began to swing towards them. "He sees us. Gunner. Same target. Turret ring. Fire." Their shot and the Germans were near simultaneous. A blinding flash and a deafening clang as the German shell struck the Matilda's glacis plate right where the hill met the armor. The impact was colossal, a shudder that ran through the entire hull. Lights flickered. A shower of dirt and ice fell through the commander's hatch. But the thick, sloped British armor, backed by tons of frozen earth, held. Petro's shot was true. It struck the Panzer III where the turret met the hull. There was no spectacular explosion, but the German tank's turret stopped traversing. It sat still for a moment, like a stunned animal, then began to reverse erratically, smoke pouring from its hatches. A mobility kill. The crew allowed themselves a single, shaky breath. Their hill worked. They were not just a target. They were a fortress. The Germans understood now. They stopped probing. They began to surround. Through the remaining daylight, they saw infantry moving through the trees on either flank, trying to encircle the hill. They were being cut off. Kalinin used the machine gun in short, savage bursts to keep the infantry heads down, conserving ammo, defining a no-man's land of bullet-churned snow around their position. As dusk fell, the true nature of their stand became clear. They were not holding a strategic point. They were a blockage, a stubborn clot in an artery. The Germans could not safely use the crossroads, while the fortress on the hill lived. Every minute they spent dealing with this immovable nuisance was a minute not spent advancing on Moscow. Night brought a temporary lull, but no peace. They could hear the sounds of engines, of shouted orders, of tracked vehicles moving in the darkness around them. The Germans were bringing up heavier tools. The noose was tightening. Inside, the cold was winning. Their candle guttered out. The water in their tin froze solid. Shivers became uncontrollable tremors. Exhaustion warred with hypervigilance. They were beyond fear now, existing in a state of grim animal endurance. They had inflicted pain. They had drawn blood. They had become the thorn. And now, in the freezing darkness, they waited for the hand that would try to pluck them out, knowing it would come with the dawn, and that it would be massive and final. They had traded the mobility of the ghost for the terrible, powerful permanence of the anvil. The hammer was on its way. The night was a test of endurance against the cold and the silence. Sound carried with crystalline clarity in the frozen air, the distant whine of tank engines being tested, the metallic clank of tracks, the murmur of German voices from the tree line, now only 200 meters away. They were surrounded. The crossroads below was a no-man's land, lit by the guttering flames of the destroyed half-track. Inside the Matilda, time fractured. Minutes felt like hours. Hours collapsed into a single, prolonged moment of shivering anticipation. They took turns at the vision blocks, watching the dancing shadows, their eyes straining until they saw phantoms in the shifting dark. The cold was a living entity now, a third party in the tank, squeezing the heat from their bodies, making their joints stiff and their thoughts slow and thick. Alexei, during his watch, found his mind circling the broken final drive. He visualized the shattered gears, the split housing. In the factory-lit halls of his memory, he traced the power flow from the engine, through the transmission, to that fatal, fragile point. It was an abstract puzzle, a way to escape the reality of their tomb. He pictured the tools they had, the heavy wrenches, the blowtorches, the desperate, reckless engineering of Batya's snow paddles. A mad, impossible thought began to form, not as hope, but as a purely mechanical hypothesis. Dawn came not with light, but with a low, grinding rumble from the west. It was a sound they knew, but magnified. The deep-throated growl of multiple heavy diesel engines. Through the periscopes, they saw them emerge from the tree line. Not the sleek Panzer IIIs, but two hulking Panzer IVs with the long, high-velocity 75mm guns. The Germans were done probing. They had brought the sledgehammers. The tanks moved with deliberate, confident slowness, fanning out to approach the hill from different angles, presenting no easy flank. Behind them, infantry scurried like beetles, using the giants for cover. Kalinin assessed the situation with a chilling clarity. They had perhaps 3 minutes before the Panzer IVs were in optimal firing positions. At this range, their hill would not save them. The long 75mm guns would punch through their frontal armor as if it were paper. Their remaining armor-piercing shells might scratch the paint on the advancing behemoths. This was the end of the stand. It was then that Alexei spoke, his voice a dry, rasping thing in the dark. He outlined his insane hypothesis. Not to repair the tank. That was impossible. But to perform one final short violent maneuver. To use the one working track and the broken, seized one as a fixed pivot. A crude, anchored ski. To combine brute engine power with the blowtorches applied directly to the frozen, seized gears of the wrecked final drive. To risk an internal explosion or fire for a chance at a single, lurching movement. Not to escape the hill, that was suicide, but to change their facing, to reposition their grave. The blowtorches, on the broken gears inside the housing, he whispered, the image ludicrous even as he said it. Heat might expand the metal, just enough, to unseize it for a few seconds. Enough to crawl, not down the hill, along the crest, to there. He pointed on the mental map to the northern edge of their hill, which offered a steep, almost direct line of sight down into the crossroads, where the German command and support elements would logically be, where the infantry was massing, where the Panzer IVs had come from. Kalinin understood instantly. This was not a plan for survival. It was a plan for a final, more devastating strike. To cease being a stationary target and become, for one last time, a weapon in motion. To trade their fortified advantage for the element of utter, catastrophic surprise. To die not as a pillbox, but as a spear. There was no discussion. There was only the ticking clock of the advancing panzers. Batya and Petro prepared the blowtorches, their blue flames hissing in the confined space, adding a new, terrifying layer of heat and the smell of burning paraffin to the mix of cold and oil. Alexei, with a wrench and a hammer, opened the access plate to the broken final drive inside the fighting compartment. The sight was a mess of cracked iron and mangled steel teeth. As the first Panzer IV fired a ranging shot that screamed over their turret and blasted a crater in the hill behind them, they committed to the madness. Batya, his face a mask of concentration, directed the roaring tip of a blowtorch into the mangled gear cluster. The metal began to glow a dull, then a cherry red. The stench was overpowering. Petro manned the second torch, heating the frozen track linkage from outside through a vision port. A desperate, supplementary effort. "Engine! Full power! Now!" Kalinin yelled. Alexei, already in his seat, slammed the throttle forward. The healthy right track clawed at the frozen earth behind them, throwing up a storm of dirt and snow. The tank trembled, wanting to pivot around its dead left side. For agonizing seconds, nothing. Only the scream of the engine and the hiss of the torches. Then, from the bowels of the broken drive, came a sound of tearing, grinding agony. The seized, heated metals expanded, shifted. For one horrific metallic second, The left track jerked. It didn't turn. It skidded, the frozen paddled links acting as a crude sled on the packed earth. The Matilda lurched, not forward but sideways, crabbing along the crest of the hill with a deafening, torturous shriek of tortured machinery. It was a movement of pure violence, a 5-ton steel beast having a seizure. Inside, they were thrown about like dice in a cup. The blowtorch flames danced wildly, threatening to ignite anything they touched. From the German perspective, it was incomprehensible. The immovable fortress, the stubborn pillbox they were about to obliterate, had suddenly, impossibly, come alive. It was moving in a way no tank should move, sideways, jerking, trailing smoke, and the stink of superheated metal, like a wounded animal making a final, desperate charge. It lasted 10 seconds, 20 meters. The Matilda ground to a final shuddering halt at the northern lip of the hill, its nose now pointing down the steep slope directly at the German rear area. The left track gave one final grinding scream and seized permanently, the heated gears welding themselves into a solid, molten lump. The blowtorch fuel ran out, the flames dying with a pathetic sputter. But they had done it. They were in a new position, exposed, utterly vulnerable, but oriented towards the enemy's soft belly. Below, chaos erupted. German infantry, who had been advancing up the hill, were now caught in the open behind their own Panzers. Support vehicles, a command car, an ammunition truck, were visible, clustered near the tree line. The 2 Panzerweifers, confused by the sudden movement, were slow to react. Their turrets began the long, slow traverse to realign on this new, unexpected position. Kalinin didn't give them the time. "Gunner, ammunition truck at the tree line, fire fast!" Petro, battered and half-deaf from the metallic cacophony, found the target. The high-explosive shell flew true. It struck the truck's cargo bed. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. A secondary detonation of stored ammunition tore the vehicle apart and sent a fireball rolling into the sky, engulfing the command car and scattering infantry like burning leaves. The shock wave rocked their own tank. But they were not done. "Machine gun! Infantry in the open! Traverse left!" Petro switched, hosing the panicked German soldiers caught between the hill and their own burning rear. It was a slaughterhouse, but a necessary one to buy the final, precious seconds. The lead Panzer IV finally fired. Its shell hit the slope just below their new position, the impact collapsing part of their earthen berm. The next shot would be direct. "Last AP, gunner, nearest Panzer, driver's viewport, fire." It was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot. Their last armor-piercing round flew down the hill. It struck the advancing Panzer IV low on its glacis plate, not penetrating, but ricocheting upwards with a shower of sparks into its open commander's hatch. The German tank stopped dead, smoke billowing from its interior. It was the last miracle their broken T-urn would provide. The second Panzervieh's gun was now squarely on them. There was no time to reload. No more maneuvers. No more tricks. Inside the Matilda, there was a strange, profound quiet. The engine still ran. The right track idly churned snow. They had expended their fury. They had performed their final impossible maneuver. They had transformed from a fortress back into a weapon for one glorious, devastating moment. Kalinin looked at his crew, Alexei pale and bleeding from a fresh cut, Batya's hands raw from the torch, Petro's eyes wide with the aftermath of fury. They were no longer just a crew. They were a single, exhausted will. The muzzle flash of the surviving Panzer IV blossomed in the gray morning light. a final brilliant flower of fire aimed directly at their hearts. The world ended in a white-hot star, and a sound beyond sound. The German shell struck the Matilda's exposed turret face with the force of a falling mountain. Inside, the universe compressed into a single point of absolute violence. Light ceased to be illumination and became a physical blow. A flash that seared through closed eyelids, painting skeletons against the dark. The sound was not heard, but absorbed. A pressure that obliterated thought and filled the skull with molten lead. The tank did not explode. It endured. The British Castile, forged in a Midlands furnace a lifetime ago, held for a critical microsecond before yielding. The armor cracked, but it did not shatter. The force denied a clean entrance, transformed into pure kinetic madness inside the hull. Alexei was thrown forward against his steering levers, the impact driving the breath from his lungs in a silent scream. Batya, half-turned from the empty ammunition racks, was lifted and slammed against the gun breech. A dull, final thud. Petro's world became a cascade of sparks from shattered electrical circuits, and then a heavy darkness. Kalinin, in the commander's cupola, took the full brunt of the blast's upwards vomit. A hurricane of fragments, fire, and concussed air. Then silence. Not true silence, but a dense, woolen ringing that swallowed all other sound. The world was reduced to this iron coffin, now filled with smoke, the stench of cordite, burnt wiring, and a new, coppery, intimate smell. Time stretched and snapped. Consciousness returned in painful, flickering increments. Kalinin was on the floor of the fighting compartment, something warm and wet flowing down his temple. He saw nothing from his left eye. He heard Alexei coughing, a wet, ragged sound. He heard a low, steady groan that could have been the tank settling, or Batya dying. Petro was motionless. They were not dead. The Matilda, their broken, hybrid, stubborn beast, had taken the killing blow and kept them alive inside its ruptured heart. But it was finished. The turret was jammed, welded into place by the impact. The vision blocks were opaque with cracks and grime. They were buried alive in a metal tomb that was now their shared wound. Outside, a different world existed. The shock of the Matilda's final, crabbing charge and its devastating last shot had created a pocket of chaos. The destruction of the ammunition truck and the command car, the suppression of the infantry, the striking of the lead Panzer had caused a disproportionate disruption. The German advance at this crossroads stuttered, confused. The remaining Panzer IV, seeing the British tank finally silent, smoking, its turret cracked open like a rotten egg, did not press closer. It had a mission to advance, not to autopsy a corpse. With caution, it began to pull back to regroup, signaling the infantry to bypass the hill. Minutes bled into an hour. The sounds of battle, the grumble of engines, the shouts, receded, moving eastward, chasing a front that was flowing away from them. A strange, uneasy quiet settled over the hill. The only sounds were the moan of the wind through the shell-torn trees, the creak of cooling metal, and the shallow, struggling breaths of the men inside. Alexei was the first to move with purpose. Ignoring the sharp pain in his chest, he crawled through the gloom. He found Petro with a pulse, unconscious, a deep gash on his scalp. He used a strip of his own quilted jacket to stem the flow. He found Batya alive, his breathing shallow but steady, his shoulder twisted at an unnatural angle. Wordlessly, Alexei became a medic in hell, using their stolen German bandages, working by touch and stubborn will. Kalinin, with his one good eye, managed to force the commander's hatch open a few inches, letting in a sliver of glacial air and gray light. He saw the battlefield below through a haze of smoke and pain. The crossroads were empty of living Germans. The burnt-out skeletons of the half-track and the truck smoldered. Their hill was a scarred, abandoned monument. They had been written off. They had become irrelevant to the war's momentum. In stopping, they had been bypassed. This was their victory. This utter, desolate silence was their triumph. They had held. They had broken the tide here, for a few critical hours. They had been the thorn, and the body had passed around it. As the afternoon faded, a new sound emerged. Not Germans. From the east, from the direction of Moscow, came a low, gathering rumble. A familiar, beautiful, terrifying sound. The deep-throated roar of dozens of diesel engines. The clatter of wide tracks on frozen ground. The sharp staccato reports of T-34 guns firing on the move. A counteroffensive. The Soviet wave, fresh and furious, poured through the forest and across the crossroads below their hill. They saw the blazing wrecks, the churned earth, the scarred hill with the strange, foreign tank dug into its crest like a fallen knight. Soldiers in white camouflage smocks streamed past, glancing up at the silent, smoking Matilda with curiosity, then pressing on, chasing the retreating enemy. They were not just bypassed by the enemy. They were being overtaken by their own. Kalinin tried to shout, but only a croak emerged. He fumbled for a flare pistol, but it was buried in debris. They were invisible in plain sight, assumed to be part of the landscape of the dead. It was a lone infantry lieutenant, moving with his platoon, who broke off and climbed the hill. He approached the Matilda, with his pistol drawn, wary of a German trick. He saw the cracked turret, the British markings, the bizarre steel paddles half torn from the tracks, the blackened, frozen earth where blowtorches had scorched the hull. He saw a face in the hatch, Kalinin's, bloody and half-blind. The lieutenant lowered his pistol, his young eyes wide with a dawning comprehension of what this tableau represented. He shouted orders. Soldiers scrambled up the slope. They worked with a frantic, reverent energy, prying open the jammed hatches with crowbars, reaching into the dark, stinking interior. Hands pulled them out, one by one, into the shocking, clean cold of the winter evening. They were laid on greatcoats, spread on the snow. They blinked up at the darkening sky, their lungs heaving in air that did not smell of oil and blood. A medic attended to them, his hands efficient, his face grim. Alexei, propped up on an elbow, watched as soldiers swarmed over their tank, not as salvagers, but as pilgrims. They touched the gashes from the Stuka's guns, the scorch marks from the Panzer's shell, the cracked turret, the homemade paddles. They spoke in hushed tones. The young lieutenant stood before Kalinin. "Who are you? What unit?" Kalinin tried to give his rank and number, but the words wouldn't form. He just shook his head weakly, his one eye fixed on the tank. The lieutenant understood. He looked at the Matilda, this alien thing that had fought and died a completely Russian death. He drew his bayonet. He walked to the tank's frontal plate, near the driver's visor, where the armor was thickest and the scars were deepest. With the sharp point of the steel, he began to scratch. Not an official report, not a unit designation. He etched, in clumsy, deep Cyrillic capitals, the names he had gotten from the barely conscious crew. He stepped back. The names stood out, raw and silver against the dark, burned paint and battle scars. A testament not to a machine, but to the men who had willed it to become a monster, a ghost, a fortress, and a spear. The rumble of the Soviet advance continued to the west, chasing the retreating night. The war moved on, leaving their hill behind. Kalinin, supported by 2 soldiers, took one last look at the Matilda. It was no longer a British tank. It was a tomb, a monument, a piece of the land itself. The snow began to fall again, soft and silent, slowly dusting the cold iron, settling into the grooves of the freshly carved names, beginning the long, patient work of burying the war. But the names would remain. They had become part of the steel, and the steel had become part of Russia. They had given the machine a soul, and in return, it had given them immortality. The traveling tea urn had reached its final stop. It was home.